Pastor Bernard, how are you?
I am blessed and highly favored.
Highly
like they say
favored.
in our church.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Pastor Bernard, because, I mean, if not anything, you're a man of God, but also you've been married for 38 years?
44 years.
44
38
years.
years of ministry, 44 years of marriage.
Wow. How does that happen? How do you do that, Pastor Bernard?
And to the same woman, may I add, you ask some people that, and it's an aggregate of 5 marriages, but this is one woman, 44 years. And I will tell you, I learned a lot in the process. My book talks about really the 4 qualities of manhood and the 4 qualities that make for a lasting relationship. And I had to learn. I had to grow. I was not always the man in that book. Well, some of it, because I share some of my stories and some of the challenges that we had in our own relationship over the years.
But Pastor Bernard, I want to really talk about you because, you grew up, your dad wasn't in the home. He kind of left you guys when you were really young.
Yeah, from the day I was born. When I was born, my mother brought me out of the hospital, took me to him, and he rejected her and I at that point. And it was tough for her because the first 3 years of my life, really 3.5 to 4 years, she was in a state of depression and dealing with rejection. And she had lost so much to have me because she was on the Olympic team in Panama. She was a runner, gold medalist, silver medalist. And she had a full scholarship to come to the United States to Tuskegee Institute. They had the greatest track team then and now. And all of that was lost because I came along. So we relocated to the U.S. and started a new life, but I grew up without a father.
And what's interesting, I mean, we'll get into the book, but what's interesting about what you said is that you say in the book, don't really compromise your morals or your values for a relationship. And essentially, it's kind of what I just heard.
Yeah, indeed.
Wow.
Look, we all need a moral compass. And that's why, although I live at the intersection of faith and culture, my faith gives me the moral guidance that I need to navigate through culture, because it's so easy in our world to compromise and to give up our convictions. And that's why I talk about, even in the book, about having the courage to live out our convictions, and that comes under strength. But we're going to go through each one, right?
Yes. And a part of, your dad not being there, you had to be very responsible at a very early age. You worked after school and in the garment district.
Yeah, that's right. And I started working when I was 9 years old, hustling groceries, which is, carrying groceries and people pay you for it, cleaning backyards, shoveling snow, whatever I could do to put money in my pocket while my mother worked several jobs just to keep a roof over my head. So I was sensitive to that. And as I say in the book, maturity doesn't come with age. It begins with the acceptance of responsibility for our words, thoughts, motives, actions, attitudes. And because I had to accept responsibility so early in life, it accelerated my maturation process.
And so in that process, you're in high school and you meet this girl, you're 15 years old.
Ooh, just the A.R. Bernard life story here. Okay. Yeah, if you ask my wife, her story is a little different from mine. She claims I was chasing her. I thought it was all the way around, but I won't argue. I'll let it go. But we met in high school. We were 16 years old, or she'll say that she was 16 and I was 15. She has me by a few months. But we started a relationship, and because I was mature for my age, I was quite serious about life. I was socially conscious, involved in protests against the war in Vietnam because I understood it at an early age to be part of the military-industrial complex that the United States was feeding, and we were losing lives for because my friends, some of them were killed in Vietnam, some came back as heroin addicts, so it was really a tough time. So I was sensitive to that, and the 60s was a tumultuous time. Many revolutions taking place spiritually, politically, socially. We had the Back to Africa movement. We had the Civil Rights movement going on. We had Black Identity movement going on. And as a child whose father was white and mother was black, I was trying to resolve my own identity and understand, what do I choose? And some of that was forced upon me. I didn't have a choice. But, I am fully identified as a person of color, as an African-American person.
But in that process of finding who you were, you actually were in the Nation of Islam for
That's
a while.
right. That's right. Because as a young man dealing with the identity crisis, you're talking about self-concept, sense of meaning, sense of purpose. And the Nation provided order, strength. Elijah Muhammad became somewhat of a surrogate father to so many of us. It did not satisfy my search for God. That's a reality. Otherwise, I would still be a Muslim today. But it gave me those things that I was missing. So I was there for 5 years while I continued to seek. And that's why I was open when God sent a young lady to be my secretary at the bank that I was working. And she shared with me a different concept of Christ. Again, it's not the institution of Christianity that saved me. It's the person of Christ. I was intrigued with him, still am to this day. Then she invited me to a meeting. Met a guy who was a former gang leader of the Mau Mau's, which is a notorious gang in Brooklyn. And he shared his story. And I was really, really taken by that story. And that night, January 11th, 1985, 8 p.m., downtown Brooklyn, Baptist Temple, I gave my life to Christ. I became a Christian. But there were a lot of things that had to be resolved. And two important statements that I felt impressed on me was, number one, I'm the God you're looking for. I intuitively knew that that was the Christ. But secondly, I and my word are ones, which took me away from all of the cultural paintings and photos and pictures of Jesus, which was necessary for me, and took me to the Scripture. So my whole understanding of Christ was based on Scripture, because I had to figure out how can I now embrace what I once believed was the religion of the oppressor? How can I now embrace that? So there were a lot of things that had to be clarified.
But I really have to really explore that, Pastor Bernard, because I meet a lot of black men who struggle with that, being able to embrace the concept of Christianity because of the blanket that has been put on it. Right? And in order to have sustainable relationships, you have to have some type of faith base. That's just my perception of it all. So how do you get past that, though? Like you said, you started to look at the word and to be Christ-like, but how did you actually get past all of that?
Well, one thing that it did for me very importantly is in the journey to resolve the identity crisis, you tend to identify with your culture. Because if my father, whatever he may have been, whatever cultural context. But what the Scripture does is elevate us beyond some cultural identity and heritage, and it takes us back to our original design in relationship to God. So the image of God, the Imago Dei, in which I and all human beings were created, that took me to another level. So it was not about social status, social heritage, cultural heritage, racial heritage, or anything like that. It was spiritual heritage that really liberated me. So I began to live out and understand my identification with God as the physical human expression of a divine plan. Pretty much like the incarnation of Christ, but not being the Christ, but following that same model.
And so over time, you've traveled across the world and you've worked with people of all races, all ethnicities. I mean, you say that there are just common things that people want in relationships, that women want in relationships, right? So you have these core values, and I want to get into those. So the first one was maturity.
Yes. And I will tell you, the audacity of me to tell women what they want. But I think after 44 years of marriage and 38 years of counseling, it works. When I finished the manuscript, I handed it to my wife and had her to read it, because the number one complaint that women have about men is that men don't listen. So after she read the manuscript, she looked up at me and smiled and said, "You've been listening." And I think that's the greatest qualification right there. And all the women that I've talked to and interviewed, they agree that those four things, I mean, under each thing there are subsets, but those four things really summarize what is important in a relationship with a man: maturity, decisiveness, consistency, and strength.
So with the maturity piece of it, you meet a man, I meet a man, I'm single. I meet a man and I feel like he's struggling with something. Do you sit around and wait for this man to mature?
Absolutely not. Maturity doesn't come with age. It begins with the acceptance of responsibility. So when a woman says, "I just wish he'd grow up," what she's saying is, "I wish he'd take responsibility for his words, what he says, his thoughts, his motives, his actions, and his attitudes." She also means decorum. I wish he would learn how to conduct himself in any given situation or circumstance. Because what happens with men when they're facing an intimidating situation with their young lady, all right, if they're insecure about the situation, they tend to regress into adolescence. And when they do that, they force the woman to act like his mother. And then he gets mad at her for mothering him. So she is looking at two things: maturity, which is the acceptance of responsibility, and decorum.
Now there's signs though, like when you meet someone, whether he's responsible or not. Like, what are some red flags that you know this man may not be mature enough to sustain or even enter into a relationship?
I'm glad you said red flags, because women tend to be intuitive. Men are linear in their thinking. We have to shift from one side of our brain to the other side of our brain to process things fully. But women are intuitive. And women tend to, you use the term red flags, women tend to see those red flags and then whitewash them by their own needs and desires. And they move from making decisions with intelligence to making decisions with their emotions. That's why it's important that there's a process in relationship building. It begins with introduction, then moves to acquaintanceship, then building a friendship, then intimacy. And that process allows us to screen out some of the people that really don't meet the criteria for a healthy relationship. Some people should not move beyond introduction. But we let them. And in a world where we want to go from introduction to intimacy, we wonder why there's crisis in the relationship. It needs a process, and I'm big on process.
No, that's huge. That's huge, just to hear the process, because there's no way that you can skip the steps or kind of go back.
That's right. That's right. Too many mistakes. There are too many accidents.
Wow. So now when it comes to just principles, like people of principle, and I feel like in order to make informed and in a good judgment call, it has to be based in something. And in today's world, a lot of people are moving away from going to the blueprint, is what I call it, the Bible. You know, a lot of people are moving away from that. So how can you have a sustainable relationship? Because you even gave a quote, I think 40 to 50% of first marriages fail, and then 60% of second marriages fail.
That's correct. And 85% of relationships are doomed to fail because we don't have a set of principles and values to guide our relationship building. That's important. You know, and there's a difference, because you said something, judgment. A precept is a command. Stop. The stop sign says stop. We don't even obey that. We kind of roll through it. But stop means stop. It doesn't have to be interpreted. We don't have to try to figure it out or understand it or explain it. We're clear. But when we come to a sign that says yield, that leaves it to interpretation. It doesn't tell us who to yield to, how much to yield, how often to yield. We must judge that by the context that we find the sign in. So a principle is a broad and basic truth that requires judgment, wisdom, and discernment, and maturity in application. We get that over time and experience. So the book is a set of principles that help you get there a little sooner. And in our world where we want instant everything, I think that book is important. That's why the book is only a certain number of pages and a certain thickness, because people tend to today pick whether they're going to read a book by how thick it is. So we have to make sure it was just the right thickness.
They wanted in 140 characters or less.
Absolutely.
Bernard.
That's the world in which we live.
So when you're out and you're building relationships, and we live in this instant gratification society, how do you pace this process? How do you pace it?
Ooh, again, you know, you have to have the whole idea of process. You have to buy into it, that, you know, if you're going to build something, all right, it takes the proper design, the right materials, and time. Those are the three elements of building anything, whether it's a building, a civilization, or a relationship. And when it comes to design, that's when you have to have in mind a blueprint, a vision, a plan. That's when you consider the cost. What is this going to cost me? And I will tell you, some relationships cost more than they're worth, because we didn't take the time to, like Jesus said, count the costs before we determine to build. And that's in anything in life. Also, the environment. my mental environment, my emotional environment, the environment of the mind of the individual that I'm looking to enter a relationship with. What factors will influence and shape my attempt to build? We have to go through that. And the right materials. You have to determine, okay, what are the right materials? That's why the book gives women a framework with which to make better decisions in their choice of relationship with men. It also gives men a standard with which to measure their own manhood.
And one thing I really liked about the book was that you have places for reflection in this book where you can kind of read and go back and say, okay, well, what am I doing right in my process?
Yeah.
And what am I doing wrong? Why is it important really to write down your process?
Because we need to get it out of the mind and onto the page. And when we do that, it sticks. We get it. They say in order to really make a book yours, you've got to read it 3 times. The first time you read it, it's just an introduction. The second time, it becomes more familiar. And it's not until the third read that it's digested. So reflection is critical in making something a part of who we are, the fabric of who we are. And when we do that, all of a sudden, we begin to respond to life out of principles that we built into ourselves instinctively without trying to think of it. It just happens because it becomes who we are.
And I love how you break down Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and how the roles were kind of reversed.
Ooh, yeah.
I have to talk about this from the perspective of African-American woman who grew up in a single-parent family raised by my mother, and not having the presence of my father in the home. So I had to learn a lot of this through trial and error.
Yeah.
So what is the importance of looking at the role and that story about Adam and Eve and how she kind of, Adam wasn't decisive and so Eve did her own thing?
Yeah. Well, look, we see it in society. You know, a woman looks for those 4 things. She looks for maturity in a man, for decisiveness, for consistency, for strength. And when she doesn't see it, she will instinctively begin to compensate for it. And that means she begins to step into the decision-making process, into the strength process. She will begin to take on very subtly, all right, but intuitively, the role that the man should take. So Adam usurps his authority. And that situation in the garden, all right, left us with the reality that there is this power tension between men and women. You talk about yourself growing up in this particular world. You know, we're experiencing women having an unprecedented wealth and education experience than any other generation that we've seen so far. We have 60% of college enrollment female, and only 40% male. So there's this emerging female power class that is strong and assertive. And if the man is not secure in his manhood, he can be easily intimidated by that woman, which is making it difficult for her to find a mate that she can be secure with.
So how do we move past that?
Get my book.
There it
of
is.
course. Read A.R. Bernard's book.
Yes.
4 things women want from a man.
Yes. And I think the other thing I really want to talk about, it seems as if, I would say that you and your wife are equally yoked, right? She went through the processes with you, right? I really want to talk about that from the biblical standpoint of being equally yoked with someone and how that changes the dynamic of the relationship.
Well, I think equal is, we must carefully define.
Okay.
Because, it doesn't mean equal roles, all right? Because we understood that we occupy different roles. So there has to be one individual who accepts responsibility where the buck stops. And there has to be one person who is in a supportive role. She's accepted that, and my wife is old school, so she gets the traditional, institutional picture and model, and she works it very well. But she understands the power of a woman to actually influence a man, even though he is in that role of leadership. All right, a woman has a lot of power to very subtly influence that man and to get him to think that the ideas that he comes up with are actually his own, when actually it was her influence upon his thinking and feeling. So my wife understood the power of submission. and what that means. And for her, it was not a bad word, all right? It doesn't mean that all of a sudden she turns me into her own totalitarian dictator. No, it meant that she occupied a supportive role with me and allowed me to make decisions to develop in my decision-making process, in my decisiveness, in my maturation process, in my strength process, all right? So she complimented me, and she brought out the man in me. You know, when we look back at the name Eve and the references in Genesis to her, one of the Hebrew translations of her name is manliness. That's interesting because a woman is not supposed to be manly. But what it meant is that she actually brings out the man in the man. That is her role. That is what she draws. And that's why if you see a group of guys standing on a corner and a lovely young lady walks by, they're not just looking at her physically, but all of a sudden they'll put their chest up, stand, erect and, put on, because she immediately brings that out of them. That's by design.
I could talk to you all day, Pastor Bernard. I promise you I could. I really could. But for those who are struggling, and I know a lot of amazing men and women who really are looking for a sustainable relationship that's going to be a happy relationship, essentially a happy relationship. What is that thing that you feel like that thing that they need to tap into in order to really get on their journey, I guess is the best way.
They have to be committed to the relationship. And relationship has to do with the willingness to be self-sacrificing, to interact redemptively, being there for each other, to support each other regardless of the crisis that comes, and unconditionally, which means that we get rid of the list of reasons, and we only have one, and that is love. My wife and I had reasons why we loved each other. But we found out over time that reasons have conditions. And when the conditions are not met, the relationship can be in trouble. So today we love each other for no reason. That's unconditional love. And that's required. But we live in a world and a society that is quite selfish, not selfless. So everything revolves around me and what you can do for me. And that is not the ingredients for a successful relationship. The Bible talks about marriage having many benefits, and we understand those benefits, but there's only one goal, and that is the two become one. The word become means there's a process of growth and development. Marriage is an empathetic union where your need becomes my need becomes your need, and we care for each other in ways that we could do on our own if we were single, but we accept this mutual submission in that kind of relationship. Over the years, I've learned that there are two critical things: adapt and adjust. You must learn to adapt and adjust. Adjust means those immediate things that may be contrary to your feelings in the relationship, but you're willing to let it go and make some adjustments that are necessary for the strength of the relationship. Adapt are those changes that you make over a period of time. So those two things are very, very important if a relationship is going to last.
Adapt and adjust. And
Adapt and adjust.
And that takes the reflection, too, because you have to look at yourself.
Yeah, that's
You have
right.
to really look at yourself and say, okay, am I willing to adapt and adjust if I want to make this work? So what do you feel about these women who solicit men?
Women who solicit men, define solicit for me.
I'm sorry, not solicit, but, women who ask men on dates, or women who don't make the first move.
I have no problem with that.
Okay.
I think we live in a world where women are no longer, trapped in the home and becoming identified as someone that's unseen and unheard in society. No. Since the Industrial Revolution, women have moved into the workplace. They have gained the right to vote in our American society, and they've taken a stronger role in society. 20% of American government is head up by women. Around the world, CEOs of corporations are women. So the new generation of women tend to be more assertive and even more aggressive. And I think if a man is secure in himself, he'd like that coming from the woman, that she is being aggressive and assertive and taking the lead. But if he's insecure, that can become problematic to him because he may interpret it as a challenge to his manhood.
Okay. Okay. So one thing you said, a goal in writing this book for men is that it can be their standard for manhood. Yeah. When you say a standard for manhood, what do you mean by that, Pastor Bernard?
Well, a standard is a level of performance that we try to achieve in life. And manhood requires certain qualities, and those 4 qualities are critical to a man entering to what should be called manhood and being respected as such. So, when we set standards, it's because we're taking performance to a new level. And men can relate to performance because we're performance driven.
So 4 things women want from a man. You can get quotes, you can get journaling, reflections, scriptures. One last piece of advice from Pastor A.R. Bernard on how to get these relationships, keep them, and have them forever.
Like I said, adapt and adjust and get that book. But let me say this to you, because there are people out there who are hurting right now, and their relationships are in jeopardy. And some women keep making the same mistakes. They're broken relationship addicts, and that's a problem. Let me say, it's never too late. It's never too late to get new information, the right information, apply that information. We've got to live life with hope. We cannot think that we've reached the end and it's all over. No, you just need new information, the right information, and how to apply it into a right relationship with the right person.